Welcome to Teaching Truth. David Wilkerson was a country boy preacher who, in the plan and in the providence of God, found himself in New York, reaching out to and seeking to bring the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the gangs in both Brooklyn and Harlem. Made famous in the film The Cross and the Switchblade, Nicky Cruz was one of the gang leaders who, one night at an outreach meeting in New York, was convicted powerfully of his sin. He decided to change his ways and give his heart to Jesus. If you've ever seen the movie The Cross and the Switchblade, Nicky Cruz at that moment exchanges his blade for a Bible. And as he does so, he says these words: "I'm going to give my life to God, Davy. It better work, as I damn near got killed for it. I'm going to give my life to God, Davy. It better work, as I damn near got killed for it." Words which Saul could well have spoken to Ananias that day in what became for him a changing room in the house in Straight Street in Damascus. Words which Saul could well have spoken when he realized the miracle that God was about to do in his life. "I'm going to give my life to God, Ananias. It better work, as I damn near got killed for it." And the change in Saul's life was immediate, for we read that immediately he preached about Jesus Christ in the synagogues. The same synagogues that he was going to drag people out of who believed in Jesus Christ. Amazing, the transformative work that God had done in this life of Saul. And because Saul was a skilled student of the then great Rabbi Gamaliel, Saul took advantage of the synagogue custom that invited any able Jewish man to speak from the scriptures at synagogue meetings. He took advantage of that opportunity immediately. He didn't waste time. He preached about Jesus Christ. The message of Saul became all about Jesus, not about Saul. He needed to get across and to impress on people that Jesus was one to be known, that Jesus was one to be followed. Now, people understandably in the synagogues and in Damascus were genuinely amazed and astonished at Saul's conversion. It must have been so hard to believe how powerfully Jesus had changed this man's life. This man who had a reputation for being violent, for being angry, for being the man who dragged people out of houses, the man who had signed the death warrant of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Yet years later, Paul himself, who was Saul, Paul would write, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone. All things have become new." Paul lived that verse. Paul lived that verse long before Paul wrote that verse. Saul increased all the more in strength. Now, after a few days, the Jews plotted to kill him, and news of this plot reached Saul, and they watched the gates of the city day and night. But because God had chosen Saul, who was to become Paul, and God had a work for him to do, the disciples took him, that is Saul, and let him down through the wall in a large basket. I mean, that was the great escape, the real great escape. There is nothing triumphant about sneaking out of a city by night in a large basket. It was the beginning of many escapes for Paul. And sometimes Paul was caught, and sometimes Paul was beaten, sometimes Paul was imprisoned. He did have to suffer many things for the sake of Jesus Christ and for the sake of the gospel. But at that moment, Saul needed that divine protection in the midst of persecution. Paul went on to become a great servant of God, a mighty instrument in God's hand. Barnabas, who we read of later on, took him and brought him to the apostles. We need to thank God for people like Ananias and Barnabas who welcomed Saul, who encouraged him and who gave him that entry point when many might well have been reluctant to embrace such a dramatic conversion without seeing it with their own eyes. People in Jerusalem could well have been forgiven for being suspicious of Saul even after his so-called, in their eyes, conversion. People could well have been forgiven for still being suspicious of Saul. But Saul had met Jesus. There was no going back for Saul. Saul had been in that changing room, in that house in Straight Street in Damascus. His life had been forever changed. And we need to welcome new Christians into the family of God with simple friendship, just like David Wilkerson welcomed Nicky Cruz. Nicky Cruz, through the transformative power of the good news of Jesus Christ, went on to reach literally thousands, many of them teenagers, who gave their lives to Jesus Christ. No one could ever have had imagined it, but with God all things are possible. The story of Saul's conversion begins with him leaving Jerusalem to persecute the followers of Jesus in Damascus. And it ends with him leaving Damascus, leaving Jerusalem as a persecuted follower of Jesus, and literally preaching and teaching to thousands of people for the sake of the gospel, and becoming the greatest missionary statesman in the history of the church. A true changing room experience which led Nicky Cruz to places and to people he could never have had imagined. A true changing room experience which led Saul to become Paul, to places and to people he could never have had imagined. A true changing room experience, if you say yes to Jesus Christ and commit your life to following him, can lead you to places and to people you could never have had imagined. For with God, all things are possible.